No, it's correct. Yeah, you're not the only one.
I'm surprised because right now I'm
Yes.
meeting people, recording, who specializes on various wonderful things that I'm interested about. So I love talking with her, including the far right, hate speech, critical digital political economy, and so on. Then we have Matthew Feldman. Matthew, are you here? Maybe.
I'm here. Hi there.
Hi, Matthew. Who I think is in T-side now. Is that?
Oh, no, not in T. Happily retired from academia. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Right. Okay. So there you go. That you are the one that has gotten out of the jail.
Perhaps just in body, but not in mind. The habits of mind formed, I'm
It's the
afraid,
Stockholm syndrome.
they're plagues for a lifetime.
You never actually get out. Yeah, meanwhile, I mean, in my head, I'm trying to remember how I go live streaming. I mean, it's been such a day, I have to tell you. Okay, right. Okay, continuing. So then we have Bernhard Forchtner, who is an associate professor at the School of Media Communication and Sociology in my school at the University of Leicester, who works on the far right in Europe. I forgot to say what Matthew does, who works on the far right in the US. That was, yeah. And so we have a far right symptomatic situation going on there with the Capitol storming that provided some of the inspiration for this event as well. And then we have Jonathan Ogg from Amherst, who's an associate professor in Massachusetts, who is going to talk a little bit about, give us an insight on the conspiracy, New Age ideology, astrologers, New Agers, yoga people, and so on, the far right, but who has also worked on disinformation in the Philippines. And that's he was a former colleague of us in Leicester. And then Rob Dover, Rob, I can see him, he's here, who left us very recently from Leicester. It's like, I cannot seem to get over losing my colleagues. So I have to see them straight after. So he's who is a professor at the University of Hull. And works on disinformation and more intelligence and geopolitics kind of aspects, political aspects. And then Aliaksandr Herasimenka, who was at the Oxford Institute and works on digital activism in authoritarian settings. Then it's Jacob Matthews, who is professor at Paris 8, professor in information communication sciences, and have worked together in various wonderful projects, including a recent one on leadership in social movements, who works on labor, digital labor, platform economics, and some relevant work to what we want to discuss about digital political economy. And then maybe I can say something about the pandemic. Now, since I've done this introduction in a hurry, okay, Geert is gonna start first, I think, to give us a little bit of a background, but I want to take a moment here to thank you all for coming, because I know it's difficult to find time to speak to ourselves at the moment, let alone speak to other people. So it's wonderful to see so many people here, and I wanted to have an outlet to have a discussion about this, and I want to encourage this discussion. I want to take the breather, so somebody focus my mind to remind me how on earth I go live streaming here. So I'm just trying to remember. So anyone, any ideas? I need some help. Athena needs help. Can anybody remind me how I take this live? Anybody? I mean, I'm so, I think I'm a little bit overwhelmed at the moment admitting people. I'm still admitting people. So if anyone has any ideas, this is the time to tell me. I cannot remember this. I've lost myself. Anybody? I'm on my phone. But I think it's at the bottom. That's what I've been looking at as well. So maybe.
Are you talking about Facebook?
Yeah. So there's like a Facebook or YouTube function, but I'm just lost. This
Athina,
can happen.
if I may, there is probably something in meeting account management, meeting advanced, and then you can select. I'm reading here on the Zoom guide. You can allow live streaming to the meetings. You select that account management, and then in meeting is the menu advanced, and then you click the toggle next to allow live streaming the meetings, and then you choose which services you want to use.
Oh dear.
I like your microphone. It really makes a difference. Huh?
Yeah, I'm trying to please the students.
Yeah, well, I can hear. Lucky them.
Yeah, I thought that beside the content, the pleasure in delivering, it's also,
Wow.
I'm trying to.
Okay, maybe
twice before, and I cannot recall it. I mean, this is.
Maybe I'll just start, and then you can Athina, you just sort it out, and yeah.
Sort it out. Yes.
Yeah. Welcome everyone. Also, on behalf of Athina, we have discussed the issues of today quite often in the last couple of months, and this is how things got together. And yeah, it's about strategies of online activism. That's a very broad theme. Of course, it goes back decades ago, and we decided not to focus so much on the history, not on tactical media in the 90s or Occupy. Probably not even so much on, Black Lives Matter and let's say Extinction Rebellion, for the simple reason that even in the past, let's say 2-3 months, an enormous amount of stuff has happened, right? So we don't even have to go back 1 year ago. Maybe this is frightening, but it also just tells us, that there's so much going on. We don't even have to go back a long time ago to really look at the urgent strategic topics that are on our plate. For me, there's a few things we can let's say distinguish. There is let's say the social media critique and the platform critique. Right, and in our Institute of Network Cultures, we've dealt with that already for 10 years now in the Unlike Us project, where we emphasize the strong link between, let's say, the critique of the social platforms and the development of alternatives. For a long time, alternatives were kind of dead or a good idea. Not much happened. Of course, lately we have seen, that things have moved on, and especially also because more and more people understand the critique of the dominant platforms. So recently, we've seen the real uptake of the use of Signal, Telegram, but even simple things as DuckDuckGo as an alternative to the Google search engine. And lately now, of course, even in the past few weeks, the really sudden rise of Clubhouse and so on, right? That list goes on. Of course, in different parts of the world, this is also very different. So the use of alternatives is by no means, global. There are many, many parts of the world where different alternatives are taking up. Okay, so that's the relationship between let's say, from the critique to the alternatives. Then, of course, for many social movements and issues, the existing platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, you name it, you know, that this is still an issue. Should we use them, yes or no, and how to use them, and should we focus on you know, censorship, or you know, the Facebook is taken out. Look at Myanmar right now and what's going on there, right? And you know, should it be up to us to say, you know, forget about it and you know, build your own communication infrastructure, and you know, forget about Facebook in the first place? This is still an issue, because there is no, you know, synchronous development happening in the world. All this is all in very different stages, and the use of the social media is anything but planetary. And of course, recently, even more so, you know, for instance, in the United States, Google, Facebook, but even Twitter and so on, they are deplatforming people, not just Trump, but you know, they're trying altogether probably to get rid of so-called you know, political content. So there is that development happening as well. Plus, of course, you know, if you look at what happened with Parler and after January 6th, this is also a very you know, interesting development that could also happen, you know, to let's say progressive apps, and which calls into question, you know, should we focus on apps in the first place if they can so easily be removed from telephones and so on, right? And then I think behind, there's always looming in the background this idea of information warfare, and more specifically cyber warfare, right? And sometimes this comes up, and sometimes you know, we have more like a WikiLeaks or an Edward Snowden moment. Sometimes it goes again very much in the background, and this calls into question, you know, are we actively participating in this information war, or are we merely you know, outsiders looking at it or seeing it as a threat, or which reminds me, you know, the Polytech I worked with, by the way, in Amsterdam, quite a big one, 50,000 students, was heavily under attack today. So we are ourselves at the moment the victim of a big cyber attack. Not sure. The Dutch Research Council, by the way, yesterday was attacked, and we suspect that this large organization is now also the victim of ransomware. Just to name, you know, two examples that are going on. And I think we have to face this very slow but sudden development over time from, let's say, information or cyber activism to cyber warfare. I mean, that's probably, you know, what a few of you will also talk with in direct or indirect terms. Okay, I want to leave it here. Let's start.
Okay, so then I suppose like now I have to follow up on all this. I think I'm going to change tack a little bit, and I'll be much more focused on one platform. I'll see if I can share my screen. Oops, you have disabled this, Athina, so if you could enable screen sharing, because of course I have a PowerPoint. But just to give you an idea of what I want to talk about is very specifically the way in which Facebook manages content moderation. And to use this as an example, I want to use this as an example of a broader argument that I want to make, that is that that the dilemma of freedom of speech or censorship does not stand or should not stand. Let me see now. Okay, so I hope you can all see this screen now. So the main thing that I think that we need to know about how Facebook in particular manages content is that it employs a variant. Let me just preamble this by saying all this work is work that I've been undertaken in collaboration with Paloma Viejo Otero, and a lot of what I'm saying now are arguments that have been developed in our work in common, and some of these will appear in Paloma's PhD thesis soon to be defended. No pressure, Paloma, by the way. So the main way in which Facebook manages its contents is through a liberal governmentality variant that we call neoliberal corporate bureaucracy. So this is bound to produce certain rules which regulate contents, but with a view to ensuring freedom of circulation of information. So basically, this is, I think, key to understanding how Facebook operates. They want information to keep flowing so that then the data that people produce through this information that circulates can be monetized and commodified appropriately. So all the rules they develop in terms of their content moderation revolve around these kinds of like main principles. So which could be distilled into one sentence: to retain an uninterrupted flow of information in order to safeguard data markets. And all this kind of like apparatus, including their brand identity, ideas on user safety, their legal and regulatory compliance, transparency reports, and so forth, that are all oriented towards this kind of like goal. All these contents that Facebook understands as problematic, ranging from, I don't know, showing nipples and nudity to spam, but also including extremely problematic like racist hate speech, misogyny, misinformation, so forth, they all constitute, from the point of view of Facebook, potential bottlenecks of circulation, and this is why it needs to address them. So how do they develop policy? I base this on a graph that was shown to us by a high-ranking Facebook executive, but I'm not allowed to share the original, so this is an adaptation. So they begin by what they call a trigger point. So a trigger point could be anything from like media reports to patterns that were picked by their AI system. So these trigger points then lead to the necessity to change policy or to adapt or to adjust policy when it comes to content moderation, which they refer to as ideation. So then the trigger point leads to ideation, leads to the development of the policy, the launch, and then it goes back into feedback. So they then somehow assess the extent to which this policy was successful, because if it triggers another point, then they have to go back and follow the circle again. So I think it's very important to understand from the point of view also of the remit of this meeting in terms of activism, that trigger points suggest that Facebook is receptive to outside pressures, because if it doesn't follow majority or mainstream opinion, then the circulation of information on the platform can be compromised. I think it's important to know that they have feedback processes, because that shows that they make continuous adjustments. And of course, making continuous adjustments is very much part of this kind of like liberal, neoliberal governance that has to kind of like justify its role on the basis of efficiency. Are we doing what we must do? And so it's continuously looking at itself and creating work for themselves. So then when it comes to censorship, well, can we actually speak about censorship? Because I think that basically the criticism is here misplaced, because censorship, I understand it as a tactic aimed at stopping the flow of information, but Facebook is more concerned with removing barriers to the circulation of information rather than stopping information. So all these interventions in terms of removing or deplatforming or suspending accounts, they are undertaken in order to prevent these kinds of like bottlenecks or accumulation of a lot of information that would then prevent other information to come through. And I quote here Zuckerberg himself in a very important document that Paloma and I have been poring over, which is called Blueprint for Content Governance. Where he says that he quotes internal Facebook research that we have no access to say that what they define as polarizing, provocative, or sensationalist content attracts more and more engagement because it gets engaged by both those who agree and those who disagree. And then if you have a lot of people talking about one subject, then you get all the shit posters, the spammers, everyone involved. And then this creates a kind of like a huge issue for Facebook, because then it doesn't allow for the kind of like diverse information that they rely on to produce high quality data to sell. So of course, what Facebook considers polarizing or provocative is entirely in line with US-based centrist political ideology and morality. It's the horseshoe approach, where you have the center that are the ones that are like, the ones that we should basically follow, and then everyone else to the left and right are considered to be extreme. So the main points here that I want to make, and I will finish here, is that it's less a question of censorship in its political dimension, and more, I think, the direct result of neoliberal corporate bureaucracy, which is concerned with preserving information flows and data markets. I don't think it's useful in any way to demand that Facebook stop censorship, because it cannot function if it does this. It cannot function by allowing all kinds of contents to circulate on its platform. So I think this kind of a dilemma of, the price for freedom of speech is hate speech or extreme speech, I think it shows the limits of liberal governmentality. Basically, I think that it's only a dilemma for liberals. And from this point of view, I think that it represents a kind of like a Gordian knot that you can only resolve it by cutting through it and saying, I refuse to follow this kind of like dilemma, because it's a false dilemma. It's a dilemma that belongs to a particular, I suppose, ideological viewpoint. So I think that what we need to take out of this kind of like very brief presentation is the receptivity of Facebook, which is important for activists, and the fact that you cannot reform Facebook as long as it has this kind of particular business model. So I will stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'm following on, and I was going to talk about an entirely different subject, but I think that this is a really fascinating area for debate. So I'm actually going to respond to the two speakers just with some notes that preceded us in the spirit of hopefully engendering debate, and take particular issue with the idea that we can't reform Facebook. Much of my work over the last 12 to 18 months has in fact been with a lot of the large platforms, including with Facebook. And it seems to me that one of the reasons that engagement may be low with academics and other stakeholders is that they're ships passing in the night. And I'll just outline what I think are the two key problems and talk about the way in which Facebook is, and in fact, the other platforms are in fact reforming quite substantially, perhaps not satisfactorily, but in particular on extremist and terrorist content through the Global Internet Forum of Countering Terrorism. But just two observations first, because I do think that it's a problem that needs solving rather than one that necessarily needs theorizing. The first is simply just a matter of scale. And I think that people oftentimes forget that. There are 2.5 billion users of Facebook weekly. individual billion users. So that crosses all continents, that crosses all social demography. We're actually talking about half the world on social media. When it comes to trigger incidents that are now in terms of terrorism called content incident protocols, again, I think that reflecting on the matter of scale is imperative for activists and academics. So if we go back to the awful murder of 51 worshippers in Christchurch, which fundamentally changed the dynamic of social media engagement and the large platform engagement with a lot of these problems. Within 24 hours after this horrific murder of 51 worshippers, 2.7 million different copies of that video were circulating on Facebook alone within 24 hours. 2.4 million of them were taken down. Now, again, as a rough estimate in terms of thresholds, you're approaching 90%, which if you're taking down 9 of 10 bad things is probably pretty good. But it obviously, in that case, left hundreds of thousands of videos going around. And the problem is, again, a technical one that relates to how those videos are in fact coded. And I think that that's a really important question, because the governmentality that Facebook engages in is multivariate and oftentimes can see, and I shouldn't just relate these comments to Facebook. This is all of the main 4 platforms, which again, don't forget, comprises about 95% of the internet. Okay, so 19 out of the 20 things that you see or that individuals see are likely to come from one of 4 corporations. And the moderation, in fact, can be outsourced. So the idea that it's just Facebook's moderation or censorship runs foul of, I think, another problem, which is, again, given this scale, we are talking about these platforms being an effective public square. They are effectively where things like Speaker's Corner may have happened 200 years ago. The difference, of course, is where that public square was in some senses guaranteed by freedom of speech or liberal notions of being able to put whatever arguments one wants, short of inciting violence and now racism. The difference is, of course, these public squares are owned and operated by private capitalist companies. They're aware of that. I think everybody who reflects on it is aware of that. The idea that these companies actually want any of this kind of inflammatory material, I think, is one of the other and greatest, perhaps, misconceptions. This does not help them. And in fact, the interpretations that are put on the over interpretations that are put on the platforms as a whole clearly don't help their business model. They may be too big to fail, but they're not too big to lose share price. And I think that that means that they have been energetic in taking down some content. But when you're talking about 2.5 billion accounts, by definition, you're talking about taking down content at scale. And that becomes the problem. When it comes to terrorist content, I think that we're going to be seeing greater changes in 2021 than we have seen since the use of the floppy disk. It will be fundamental reform, literally, since the floppy disk, the laws that came in 1994. So we will be seeing fundamental reform. There is no doubt that there is going to be a hardcore of people who don't like Facebook anyway, who are going to reject the platforms and their approaches and a degree of proactivity. But perhaps I would just conclude with this. The very fact that up to 3 million copies of the Paris Manifesto can be circulated online means that this is a problem that needs solving, and it actually needs people pushing in the same direction. And I would suggest, that academics and activists also need to reflect on that, as well as the companies which, in my impression, realize that they too must also do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Oh.
There was a yawn. Okay, so Bernhard, I think. Bernhard, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you actually see my screen?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay, I only have one slide, so it's not a big thing anyway. But I thought I'd better have a slide because I don't really have one big argument. It's rather a series of observations which came up in the course of watching and following what far-right activists, especially German-speaking far-right activists, came up with during and in the course of the storming of the Capitol in January. And I thought I would just kind of throw in 4 observations, and then we might have a discussion that might connect to some of your observations or not. Now, what are these 4 points? Or before I turn to the 4 points, let me just say more specifically, this is about German-speaking far-right. It's about a segment within the German-speaking far-right, which is associated with the new right, basically a group of people associated with the identitarian movement, with generation identity, and yes, that's the group which is now likely to be banned, or maybe going to be banned by the French state, the French chapter. Now, these people, they pump out a lot of material. They are very media savvy. And a few things I want to point to are first, and that's probably least surprising, what they did is they downplayed in their videos, in their pictured material, in their Telegram, and so on and so forth. They tried to play down the series of the event. That's not really a surprise. They didn't speak about uprising. They didn't celebrate it as an insurgency, but they spoke about a chaotic happening. They spoke about political masturbation. They spoke about Dionysiac individuals which sought gratification, short-term gratification, and so on and so forth. And what that brought to mind, at least to my mind, was this idea of carnival. While they didn't speak of carnival, I think all the words they used, the ways in which they described this event, mobilized these associations of carnival. Carnival being an event where boundaries, where conventions, where hierarchies are turned upside down or suspended. Now, if you think of particular characters there, like the QAnon shaman, you might actually kind of get why they want to point in that direction, or why they want to make us think about carnival, about what happened in terms of carnival, also because of the association that brings the associations which are mobilized when we think about the event in terms of carnival. But it was certainly not a carnival, because carnival is thought about in terms of irony, in terms of equality and freedom, in terms of a variety of voices, in terms of, as I've already said, suspending hierarchies and so on and so forth. What happened in the Capitol was actually melodrama. It was about sharp polarization between good and evil, between what they saw as good, Trump and so on and so forth, standing up for the nation, standing up for the ethnic body, the white Europeans, versus, on the other hand, the evil elite, the globalists, and so on and so forth, Pelosi. And just recently we saw these additional videos about what was going on in the Capitol, which kind of further underlined that. The second point is concerning QAnon. There was a lot of talk about QAnon, a lot of talk by journalists recently about QAnon going global, becoming a worldwide conspiracy theory, which is taken up across the globe. But what I was listening to, what I was hearing in these various videos, was that actually everybody, at least in that segment of people, ridiculed QAnon. So rejected Q ideas, criticized it because of lack of discipline, actual lack of plan, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying here is that we should be very careful to now rush in the direction of analyzing or thinking about all these problems in terms of conspiracy theories, and in terms of generalizing maybe developments which happen in the US, across the US, because at least in Europe, and at least amongst those who have a more ideological foundation, so to say, people who are properly socialized as far right. I don't quite see that QAnon is such a big thing. Another thing concerns deplatforming. Of course, we've already heard about deplatforming, and there was quite a lot of discussion about deplatforming also amongst these activists, with the idea that these platforms, Silicon Valley more generally, are quote unquote masters of the planet if they want. There's talk about big tech and woke capital running amok. Now, what was really then kind of more fascinating were these fantasies of an alt-tech far-right alternative structure, platforms and fintech structures being genuinely far-right and kind of belonging genuinely to this camp. And that is something what would be interesting to hear more about from people who are actually working on platforms. And then finally, there was a lot of talk about globalists and Black Lives Matter and the lying media, who are all trying to, and that's again a quote, destroy us, to remove us from history, quote end, and us, of course, is white Europeans. But already a week after the actual event, this whole argument about the Capitol kind of started to diminish, started to go into the background, and was quickly replaced by talk about the anti-lockdown protests. And these anti-lockdown protests, as they are spreading throughout Europe, they kind of are a new site for so-called patriotic resistance against globalism, what they call globalism. And that for me was a great example to see that there is this awful amount of online activism, of info war, cyber conflict driven by these actors. But at the end of the day, they still see the battleground being very, very much a kind of on the street and getting real. And actually they have all very much participated in these activities on the streets. That's it, yeah.
Thank you, Bernhard. Thank you for that insight to the Capitol story. Fascinating. Jonathan Ong, is Jonathan here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much for having me. Great to see everybody and to exchange ideas with you all. So I'm working on two different things. One is to continue my research on disinformation shadow economies in Southeast Asia. So this brings in a kind of global South perspective to some of our discussions around platform accountability and technology regulation. And so I guess I wanted to start with that, and then I'll also share with you some ongoing work in progress research on QAnon conspiracy theorists, particularly from the mystical community online. So this is a group of like astrologers, mystics, tarot readers I've been observing for the past couple of months. So, and I think it connects to two of the discussions that we're having so far. So I guess first around platform accountability from a global South perspective, and I think it connects to what Eugenia has expressed to us, also what Matthew has shared with us. So I find that I found it actually quite surprising that in the wake of the great deplatforming of Trump and his legion of far-right supporters and QAnon conspiracy theorists, that my colleagues in the US have obviously celebrated this deplatforming. It is a way to mitigate the global spread also of hate speech and conspiracy. Um, um, However, I was observing among Asian activists, journalists, even within the communities I've been working with, there's more skepticism that I think people in Southeast Asian countries with direct experience with regimes of censorship, governments really extending various kinds of censorship laws, or not even using censorship, but various forms of lawfare, of legal intimidation through using taxation laws or business kind of penalties. People are very wary of certain kinds of groups making all these decisions as to what is platformed or not. And I thought it would be much more widely celebrated by these activists who would, of course, benefit from, this global spread of hate at least being cut, this kind of supply chain being cut. But there was some skepticism there. And I think here, what I've been trying to also communicate with Southeast Asian activists and journalists and linking them up with policy folks here in the US who have been lobbying for platform accountability is that the discourse of platform accountability also needs to be coupled with perspectives of tech regulation from below. So for some folks, like to assign accountability to Facebook to deplatform certain bad actors, for example, in the context of the Philippines, a country I'm from, to deplatform Duterte or other kinds of influencers who are supportive of him, it might benefit journalists. Uh, at the same time, um, some politicians might also see this as an opportunity that, hey, perhaps it is important to also compel platforms to adopt to certain kinds of regulatory frameworks within. And of course, politicians would want to dictate which content would be in social media. So also thinking about how Southeast Asia has introduced a variety of anti-fake news laws that have also been accused of government overreach. Singapore's model of anti-fake news regulation gives government regulators powers to compel platforms to take down certain content. And I think that's what local activists are worried about, that it might, justify governments to extend their control. So that's one thing, and I would love for you folks to share perspectives of what you think this discourse of platform accountability might enable, but how could it also be hijacked by local politicians who could be like very opportunistic within this particular political moment. So my second project, which I'm excited to share with you about, is on QAnon conspiracy theorists. And here, there's a broader project of colleagues at the Harvard Shorenstein Center looking at QAnon as a networked conspiracy, right? And so there's different kinds of narratives which are housed by QAnon. So it's never really coherent, but um, each conspiracy theory, whether it be like the 9/11 being a hoax or planned, right? Moon landing being faked, etc. Kennedy assassination, etc. These are all separate conspiracies, but for some reason have been interlinked by QAnon and also with a clear alignment with Donald Trump. So I'm looking at the witch community and the mystical community in particular. So looking at how various spiritual influencers who of course have found a lot of seekers in the time of the pandemic. So people searching for meaning, searching for answers, searching for coping mechanisms at a time when answers are not very forthcoming. So these are communities of astrologers, tarot readers, wellness influencers who are sharing various kinds of self-help kind of narratives, but also commenting on the political situation. So there are certain variations of this, and I would agree with what Bernhard said, that would talk about all kinds of conspiracy theory as crackpot, like in a very caricatured term, and people who believe conspiracy theories or these kinds of perspectives as totally fringe, totally other, and I'm trying to kind of like argue against that. And here, what I want to say as well is that some of those astrologers, tarot readers on YouTube, on Instagram, that I've been following, who see themselves as actually quite radical, quite progressive, who support activists, for example, who speak out again for anti-racist agenda and have a very clear anti-racist protocol on their platforms, at certain points would also be expressing certain memes, which also underplay the vaccine, spread vaccine hesitancy, criticize big pharma, and also what is very consistent across the range of these folks, whether they're the right wing, overtly Q spiritual influencers, or the more progressive tarot readers and mystics, they're all very critical about mainstream media, and that they're always saying that disconnect from mainstream media. They circulate fear, they get you into a fear state, and that's not a very healthy position to be in. And certain strands of this anti-mainstream media narrative get taken forward to the extreme, right? And so the argument that I'm trying to develop in this work is, it's important to shade in those accidental collisions in these spiritual communities, between like far right narratives, and also people who kind of see themselves as actually quite radical and actually quite left wing, that you're never too far removed from this kind of belief system. And that's what's even more concerning, rather than to see them as totally other or totally fringe. So I'll end there and would love to hear from everybody.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. I really enjoyed also discussing a lot of this with you. I think it's a fascinating story that you bring some nuance into that as well. Rob, is Rob here?
I am here.
Excellent.
It's so difficult to follow Jonathan. He's got a beautiful flat with a lovely spiral staircase. He's got a lovely microphone. It's so hard. And there's me, a humble intelligence studies scholar. Anyway, just picking up, so breaking, as I always do, breaking away from what I was actually going to say, just to reply to what I've heard there. So I think Jonathan's point about lawfare is really important. So disruption as a tactic, a government tactic to deal with disinformation, I think is really underexplored, actually. I may be corrected on that, but I don't think I will be. The second thing is around QAnon. So I'm not a QAnon specialist, but I don't have witches or mystics, which I feel really gutted about, having listened to Jonathan's presentation. But I wonder, so I think of QAnon in terms of like a computer game or a betting shop, in the sense of it seems to entice people into needing to almost like hit the next level to access the further information or further intelligence. So for me, it has a dynamic that looks really similar to internet games, more than anything that's sort of intellectually coherent. And also I do wonder, and again, this is sort of a product from somewhere else in terms of, you know, thinking through competitor disinformation in the international system, whether actually the message is important at all, whether actually just the disruption, the creation of chaos is the real thing there. Anyway, so back to the plot. So you gave me a title of Crisis Communications and International Politics. Well, I'll knock that bit off in sort of 30 seconds and then whiffle on about what I want to talk about. So in terms of the crisis communications, and I think this sort of runs for immediate responses to proper crises, but also sort of systemic crises. There's a longitudinal effect that David Smith, who I don't think's on this call, but he and I looked at when we both worked at Loughborough on Horizon 2020 project, which was that the government agencies' conscious choice to respond slowly with what they saw as validated information basically allowed a space for counter narratives, sort of pre-counter narratives to emerge. And actually what we found that we thought was the only interesting part of that was that these had a longitudinal effect. So actually it was the mis and disinformation that existed sort of 3-6 months later the actual kind of contest in the initial response to any incident kind of dissipated within days. So that longitudinal effect is something that I'm quite keen to sort of retain high in my mind. But on some like more my stuff, I guess, is this notion of information as a domain, a fighting domain, and I think it will be formally recognised as a domain of war fighting essentially quite soon. And what I think, so again, this is almost like a research notes kind of like talk, in the sense of, I think it opens up possibility of thinking in greater depth about what we already see in the arms trade, which is the linkages between private and public actors, the revolving door mechanism between the tech companies and government, and particularly those sensitive parts of government, and between the information that sort of is processed and held over cloud services, and that essentially that travels on the various forms of web that we have. And I think that opens up some kind of interesting possibilities to think about that elision between public and private, and what that does for anyone that wishes to do some online activism. One other thing is in terms of the networks that we've seen. So I think around the populists and the Brexit lot and Trump's sort of movement, if it was that in 2015, 2016, they were insular and yet very transnationally well networked. So again, from an intelligence studies perspective, these were groups that required a transnational response just at a time when the international community was pulling up drawbridges, which makes the countering of such, of these sorts of groups very difficult. This is a point, the next point links, kind of has an analogous link to the point I'm going to make about AI as well. So I think there's an unacknowledged role of intelligence and security agencies in shaping narratives. And that's not a conspiracy theory point. That's more a recognizing the structural position of intelligence agencies within government and politics. So that's really to recognize that actually they do police narratives, and they are policing counter narratives just by the operation. And so if you have a population, a self-selecting population that moves into those agencies that's been affected by widespread or industrial scale mis and disinformation, then that will have an effect on what they then choose to police and marshal when they're in post. So that moves on to the AI point, which is that we know, and it's very well rehearsed, that one of the key challenges for intelligence agencies, because they've chosen to be data warehouses, is how to discriminate between signals and noise. And one of the ways that they've chosen to do that is to try and employ machine learning to discriminate between what's useful and what's not useful. But of course, what you do see then is that the machine learning being employed, it really just compounds the effects of the biases of those writing the programs. And of course, then the compound effect of then what it picks out to then train from. But it also opens up the possibility for adversaries and competitors to basically skew the training set. That's a very reasonable way now of attacking an intelligence agency or a government security system, is basically to try and skew its training set by flooding that data set with debatable material. And that also seems pretty absent from the literature. And then latterly, really, it's about cryptography. So I was thinking, when I was thinking through what we were going to talk today, I was thinking from both the intelligence perspective and also an activist perspective in theory. And so I'm thinking back to 2011 and the Tottenham riots, and those were organized on BlackBerry messaging. And there were stories in the newspapers around how GCHQ in the UK had essentially threatened BlackBerry Messenger with, give us the cryptography keys or we turn off your servers. But it was seen as being a safe way of communicating in 2011. And then WhatsApp was seen as a relatively safe way of communicating. And now it's Signal and Telegram. And I would say Signal is the safer of the two, just from what I understand. But Telegram is lumped into that bracket. But what it tells me, the fact that we move from platform to platform, or that, the received wisdom is that the platforms shift in terms of their safety, is that really none of these platforms can be seen as being safe over a long time frame. They're all capable of being broken in some way, be it through kind of meta-analysis of who's talking to who, which might be the only way of, analyzing signal traffic at the moment. But also that as we move into, and it's also pushed then people say there are stories in the counterterrorism literature of radicalized groups essentially meeting up on Call of Duty, a gaming platform, to sort of fire their fake machine guns into walls to write messages to each other, because this is a very transient way of communicating. So actually moving to a pathology of communicating in plain sight, but in very specific locations. So I might embed on frame 14 of some video that I share with Athena a message that only she can, she can pick up because she knows it's going to be there on frame 14, and it's there in plain sight. Anyone could look at that video, but only she and I know where that message is. And that's a really interesting kind of proposition for, the information contest between the two. And then latterly, this notion of quantum computing promising to break and smash to bits standard cryptography. Well, I think it probably will do that. But we already see papers in various very high-end engineering journals around post-quantum cryptography. But I think it's the who owns that, who has the monopoly over that technology, will also partly shape this contest, information contest between governments and activists. I feel like I talked too quick, but I have finished.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. Well, that's really cool. We are with Aliaksandr Herasimenka now. Alexander, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so this year was not just the year of great protests and great shifts in the US and in Western countries, but also many protests in non-democratic and authoritarian countries that I study. Last year, we've seen one of the largest ever protest movements, at least in recent history, in Belarus, where 10 to 15% of adults took part. Russia, Thailand, Hong Kong continued struggle as well. And I think that's the subjects I study. And I think what's happening in this a bit different context, I think, can also tell us a few more things about how to approach the current challenges and current changes across media and platform landscape beyond those contexts. So I think I can offer, I think this context, context where sort of pro-democracy majority struggles with pro-authoritarian, anti-democratic minorities that hold power, this context can offer, I think, 3 interesting lessons about what's happening to online activists that inspire large-scale protest movements. Because what essentially is happening is that both pro-democracy activists in authoritarian countries and radical far-right activists in democracies, they, in a sense, face similar challenges when they approach social media platforms. At least if we take the perspective of those activists, of those people, the key challenge they face, according to them, according to their perception, is censorship, right? And what happens to all of those groups is that they get deplatformed. And in the context I'm looking into, people get deplatformed, have been deplatformed for many years. 5-10 years ago, deplatforming been happening in non-democratic countries, and that's where I think the first lessons comes in. In fact, at least in those contexts, deplatforming was never effective. It never worked in terms as intended. All of those activists, and many of them, at least, most creative and most experimentative minds, been able to learn how to move both their audiences, their networks, and their content from one platform to another. And they often been doing it in advance, preparing for what might happen to them, experimenting with different platforms, with different configurations and ideas, sort of reestablishing their audiences in new places. And for that reason, some of those activist groups in non-democracies, they've been successful. The second lesson is that basically any platform that we might call now, for instance, alternative platform, it can turn into a mainstream one very quickly, at least in terms of political speech. Telegram is a great example. Telegram, this messaging platform, wasn't important a few years ago, neither in Russia nor in Belarus nor in Hong Kong, but once pro-democracy activists been deplatformed, removed from most popular platforms in those contexts, or been censored or been threatened on those platforms, they found that Telegram is a good solution, temporarily, but at those moments of time was quite good solutions for them, solutions that satisfy their key needs of disseminating their message and overcoming what they perceived as censorship. And finally, the third lesson is most successful groups always try to stay one step ahead of their key adversaries, whether it's government, regulators, or platforms, or platform terms and conditions, or whoever try to somehow restrict them. And here comes perhaps a difference between many far-right activists in the West and pro-democracy activists in authoritarian countries. Because those pro-democracy people, they perceive not platforms as their key challenge and key threat, but rather governments. So governments, in fact, took over control over platforms in those contexts. And as we've seen so far, they were never quite successful in pursuing their key goal of silencing those activists, and until they try to ban a platform altogether, just remove it from the internet. Until that moment, they were never ultimately successful in pursuing their goal of controlling the public space and the political speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for these insights. And I was thinking, of course, I have to apologize because me changing accounts around, something happened there. So normally I will have the option to go on Facebook, and I don't have the option from this place here for some reason. So I apologize for that. We're gonna share it on the various places later on this recording. Jacob was supposed to be here, but he has some childcare intervention, I would call it at this point. So in some ways, I can talk about some work that we've been doing in the past year together, but also as part of the European project that I'm involved with, looking at civic participation, targeting adolescents between 16 and 18, and looking at what they're doing on digital networks. At the same time, to look at this, let's say, digital transformation of civic participation, you have to look a little bit about also what came before it in a way. And one way to perhaps bring some of this discussion to a direction, and this, in a way, there's a thread in all this that I was intending for today, which was to look at how perhaps activism developed historically, some of the issues with the different platforms that were mentioned as well, but also intellectually where it has been and where it is going, its future. And some of the problems that all of the speakers discussed were about the affordances, the different affordances, people migrating platforms to avoid surveillance and so on, which are very important, but also developing new tools for network activism and digital activism, activism and ICT participate politically on digital networks. These new tools, I think, are very, very interesting and point to some kind of future, perhaps on the digital network side of things and the digital side of things. We have seen innovations there. And the most recent one that I have seen interviewing Extinction Rebellion activist was they use this platform called Glass Frog, and it is rather sophisticated as a place where they have their accountabilities and roles, and they communicate and they take care that it is on a server that is carbon neutral and so on and so forth. So there are some innovations in the tools, and I think what has transpired from interviewing them, the XR activists and the Black Lives Matter activists, was more that the more, let's say, organized as an organization a movement is, the more aware they are of the surveillance problem. The policing problem, that they might be intercepted, and so on. And this organization is does not just depend on communication platforms and so on. It depends. So it is not that the innovation in how they communicate is for me the paramount importance here, because to give you an example, in the Black Lives Matter Leicester activism, the local one here that I interviewed activists from here, for example, they used run-of-the-mill stuff, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. They've used Zoom to communicate, to organize, and so on. And they had no communication actually centrally with any other BLM organization whatsoever. So how the actual thing was successful, and the big protest that happened here was successful, was more that it relied on pre-existing established organizations to bring people together. And more importantly, it relied on getting very young people that wanted to do this protest they were mentored by an older generation of activists or people that were working on stopping racism in Leicester, like different communities from different faiths and so on. So the pre-existing building up organizations that is not hostage to a platform kicking them out, moderating the content and so on, is quite important. That if that is not there, you have the problems, right? So the influencers and the celebrities and leading on Instagram and posting and whatever, they are not enough if you haven't built the organizations and the alliances and the alliances, across the board with different parts of society, and creating sympathizers, and also in the terms of the elite. Now, the intergenerational mentoring might be taking place through, Zoom meetings or whatever it is, but it is very important. And this happens also in Extinction Rebellion, in the sense that there is this intergenerational mentoring from veterans that have been part of various movement organizations before, and they ended up in XR, for example, mentoring youth strike activists, much younger activists, and also giving them an insight about how to organize a protest, adhering to COVID measures, talking to the counselors, mediating between the younger activists. So the older generation is mediating between the younger activists and the councils to get permissions and so on. Now, one other thing that has to do with the movements that I looked at, and this particular too, has to do with this emphasis on decentralized architectures of organization. It is not just an emphasis. In the case of XR, it is, they call it holacracy. So the way they organize it is actually very specific, and they have roles, and they have processes of advice processes. They have internal, external coordinators for the groups. They have facilitators. They have a process called detentions, where they resolve their problems. And in the past 6 months, because I think the pandemic forced restructuring of Extinction Rebellion, and the complaint, from what I understand, is that this restructuring could have happened faster. And the reason it takes time for decentralized distributed authority kind of systems is because they use the consent model, where if you don't consent, you have to say why, in the sense of does it harm the cause or the movement and so on. And they juxtapose this consent model to the consensus model of Occupy. And actually, the expression that was used was the model of the consensus model of Occupy, basically, that it takes ages to take decisions. Now, the consent model, if it falls into the more consensus, like a long-winded process, the complaint is we have been restructuring for 6 months, but it could have happened so much faster. It's just that people don't have the courage sometimes to push things through, and it takes a longer time to create that consent. So these are some observations that have to do with the fact that you cannot have, I think, movements that are hostage and they remain hostage to commercial corporate enterprise platforms to engage in civil association, right? So you cannot do political deliberation on these platforms and be hostage to them. So I think for me, the future perhaps is that platforms that are innovative for this activism to be organized, coordinate, recruit people, give them roles, organize them in a sustainable manner, right? You will have to have this innovation on how this communication is developed, and communication systems that are outside and they are robust, and they're not easily penetrated or surveilled by governments, be it authoritarian governments like Alexander was describing there, or Western governments, right? And during the pandemic, we see that there is this securitization of the online space, etc. Anyway, because of that, there's this great excuse. So these are some insights I've had from my research on what the future might be like. So I will leave it there. There's a lot more to say, but what I would like to do now is, if people want to come into, colleagues, I think we have experts here in various areas I will be discussing. And if colleagues want to have questions, please either put them on the chat, or better still, if you want to unmute yourselves and ask them, you're very welcome. Okay.
Can I ask a question, Athina?
Of course.
I'd like to follow up a point that Jonathan made, because I find it fascinating. This kind of platform regulation from below, Jonathan, I think this is very, very interesting. But I wonder, to what extent would, like, a platform like Facebook choose which bottom-up organizations to engage with, and if they would take them seriously? Because my understanding is they listen to people, but then go ahead and do things their own way anyway. So I wonder, like, at least, I suppose, like an organization like the European Union, maybe some US regulatory body have the power to compel them to force them to do things, whereas a group from below, they can say, okay, yeah, this is what we think you should be doing, but then they don't take them seriously anyway. So I wonder what you thought about this and how realistic this possibility is for a corporation like Facebook.
Absolutely share your skepticism, Eugenia, about that. So working with public policy officers of Facebook in the Philippines, leading up to the elections that happened there in 2019, I could get the sense, and as comm scholars, right, we always assert that corporations are not monoliths. There are various kinds of power hierarchies within an organization. Perhaps there's some agency or resistance from within as well. One could interpret some actions as ways in which, so in the Philippines and most of Southeast Asia, the baddest actors are politicians, right? Not the platforms or not influencers, it's the politicians. And I think this was a point that Alexander had made earlier, which I was super agreeing with. And I could sense that there's a way in which platforms working with politicians could be seen as like foot dragging and like not really working to be co-opted by them to introduce even harsher laws that would deal even greater harm to pro-democracy activists. And one could sense that, yeah, their hesitancy to participate in some of these meetings would be around that. There's also some ways in which one could see Facebook as more present in these meetings versus, for example, YouTube, or also like some of the Asian platforms, which are also very popular and in circulating various dis and misinformation. But certainly, when you try to engage with them in a consistent way, you're always left with so what's the long-term strategy here? It's always just like what you said in your like in the chart that you presented. It's always like a big crisis event in a PR scandal that would really get them to do something substantial. Otherwise, it's always little ways of negotiating that could take you forward, but very minimal and very incremental kinds of changes to their practice.
Thank you, Jonathan. Anyone else that has questions? A question to ask? Now is a good time. I have a question for Geert, actually, if he's still with us. I don't know. Geert, are you here?
Sure.
Yes, I was going to ask you about sort of how do you see the building up of these alternative platforms going, the innovation in that regard for movement organizations. Is this a realistic dream of mine, wishful thinking, or do you think this moving in that direction? So you don't rely on the Reddits and the, and the Facebooks and the Twitters for your activism.
Yeah, I think the deplatforming of Facebook will be inevitable. Either they will be split up by antitrust or by other forces, and I do not see why we should take side and defend these Californian companies at all. The internet, exists, can live without the platform, and in fact, we can overcome the platform stage altogether, right? And it's very clear that the platforms are not historical necessities. That scale is something that is something that just falls from the sky, or is something like second nature. Not at all. These are a kind of monopolist tendencies, and the technology has facilitated it. But even more so, venture capital has had a conscious strategy for decades to create these size companies, and the internet itself can easily put up a counterforce and break it up, and we can go in a more let's say a direction of federation, of decentralization, and of course also face it, deal with already very strong geopolitical breakups. The internet as such no longer exists. We know, there's a Russian sphere, a Chinese sphere, and there's a strong influence coming out of California. As we know, there's no counterforce to speak of coming from Europe, Europe is still kind of a neoliberal stronghold that will somehow try to regulate it with the help of lawyers, right? So this is kind of the strategy from Brussels, probably very likely movements from below will figure out that there are very, very easy to use tools for self-organization. I'm not saying that these tools, can be strong enough to encounter cyber warfare or, have superior forms of encryption, right? And there, I think it's good to listen to the warnings of the cyber experts also here in our midst. Strong encryption, can and will be broken, and this is a very, very interesting kind of prospect. But maybe also very frightening, right? Because it's yet another proof that privacy, this kind of very Western and European German dream, is simply not existing. It does not exist already in big parts of the world. Think of China. And it will maybe likely not exist in the so-called West, former West.
Here, there is a question actually that I think it is for you. What are these easy-to-use tools for self-organizing? Any examples by Mike Hoffman? And then after that, I would like to go to a question that I think Jonathan has for Bernhard. Yes. Do you think of some examples of these tools? Is the question for self-organizing?
Yeah, well, they exist to some degree, but also they can they have to be built. In some ways, they can be let's say open source, free software versions of existing commercial platforms. Just think of what's happening now with Clubhouse, right? Which is just a very easy to use kind of self-organized gathering based on audio. There's no way in the world that we need to do this on a commercial Californian platform that is founded and funded by venture capital. There's no, we can really very, very easily in this early stage come up with a version of it that is based on the same idea. And by the way, the fun thing of Clubhouse is, of course, that it auto deletes the whole thing all the time. And auto deletion is very, very likely going to be the future, right? So where we communicate very, very fast in small groups, what Ned Rossiter and I have developed in this idea of organized networks, which someone spoke about, which maybe is a more nice way of talking about networked conspiracies. In our developments of this idea, of this concept of organized networks, we have already discussed, its relation to the conspiracy, because obviously when you downsize on the network level, you come close to the conspiracy. So already this group here is a conspiracy, right? The gathering that we have here of us, we are a conspiracy, right? But there's a bit of a danger there.
Back of the tools question, so apology to interrupt here, has a question about this topic. Maybe he can come in and then we can move on to
yes, I'm here.
Yeah, nice.
Yes, no, I am here. I'm also very interested in this conversation about activism and tools online, and also wanted to ask Geert about how do you think, I mean, I know that all your work at the Institute of Network Cultures, and you've been mapping a lot of projects of, that is not just activism for what I provisionally would say that I mean, so going against something, okay? Mobilizing against a state of affairs which is deemed wrong. It's creation of alternatives, many times fueled by alternative technologies, and sometimes there is a lot of hope in those technologies as well. I know that you've been working also with Emanuele from Macau, an activist group of which I've also conducted ethnographies on. So for me, I would like to hear your thoughts about, from your observatory, of like, is this a new wave of activism? Less antagonistic, more creative, so to speak.
Thanks so much for that question. I would like to bring into the conversation again, the term we developed in the mid and late 90s of the tactical media. And maybe we could here use the word tactical networks, or even, the temporary autonomous zones that are related to that. What is strong about it is that it's focused on networks that actually come together in real time in a situation. They're very situated. So they're not long term. And this is, I think, to be able, especially young people, if you look at them, how easily they can switch from platform to platform, from website to website, right? And Facebook, of course, and especially Google also, they do not like that. They want us to stay on the platform, and we are all of us, as we say, we are stuck on the platform, and this is precisely what they want. They've created. There is no market, right? They are the market, and the platform brings together all the smaller markets on their own, on the one platform. However, young people who are active, they can so easily ignore this whole and undermine, sabotage this one very, very narrowing idea that there are no more options, right? And that there are no alternatives. According to Facebook, there are no alternatives, right? And this is what they will fight, absolutely. Yeah, they will not fight Trump. No, they will fight the idea that the internet, will allow alternatives, that we can, within 5 minutes, delete our account and go somewhere else, or even better, forget about it, because that's the best strategy. So that's my, and I'm quite optimistic, yes, about that, even though I understand we are living in very, very dark times, and that the majority of us are in fact, have to study right-wing authoritarian rules, movements, also countries where governments are taking over, these are very, very dark times, so there's not much reason in that sense to be optimistic.
Thank you, Geert. There is a question going back to the dark. We're moving from the light to the dark. So I think, Jonathan, you want to ask this question to Bernhard that you typed here. I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I can just read the question. I wanted to clarify, Bernhard, when you said QAnon is not a big thing, what did you mean by that? And whether this normalization of conspiracy thinking is something we should be worried about. How should we worry about it? How should we think about it? And also thinking about how the hijacking of, benign conspiracy theories toward hate and very insidious political agenda. And I think that's what QAnon has instructed for us. Are you worried about this?
Maybe Matthew, if he's here, he can jump in on that one, because it falls into his interest, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to hear more from Matthew about this, but let me just start, and then maybe he can add. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely say we should be worried. What my point was really not to say that it's not important or nothing we shouldn't be worried about, but was rather to say that, okay, there are certain things, certain developments, certain actors acting and developing in a certain context, which is the US. And yes, they might be taken up to some extent in other contexts, say, for example, Europe. But just because they develop in a certain way in the US context doesn't mean that they are equally relevant and have to be considered in the same way in other contexts like the US. Like Europe. I mean, in Germany, there are enough well-rooted conspiracy theories, enough far-right activists with their particular stories, contextualized, and so on and so forth. So there's enough to worry about besides, QAnon, which is there, which is something to worry, but there's enough to worry, kind of genuinely to worry about in Europe or in Germany in particular. And that brings me to the second part of my argument, or what I said about Q, and that is I was looking at a particular actor in the European / German speaking far right, and that is a very, very significant actor. And that actor, and not just that actor, in fact, there are also some, for example, quite influential neo-Nazi, shall we say, influencers or online activists who kind of say exactly the same thing, who ridicule Q, who reject it for a variety of ideological reasons. I think we need to take these ideological reasons serious in order to respond properly. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about them or should accept it or whatever. But hate and so on and so forth can have a couple of reasons, and these are not necessarily Q reasons, so to say.
Matthew, I wanted to also hear from you about the QAnon, particularly because I have been fascinated in the sense of like how it links to like pre-existing cultures on of alt-right movements, and how sometimes these movements, the earlier ones, were more game-like, and in fact I think that there was a bit of a shock about people being on this, going when they saw on the street several things they had created that have found themselves offline from the online places that they were creating them for their own perversive, perverted fun or whatever, and they found them that they were used by pro-Trump rallies and so on, that there's like this sudden kind of brick wall of reality for some of these groups that might not have expected that some of what they were creating for fun or whatever, like might have been found offline and used in different ways. I'm not saying that there are, I think there's an interesting thing there about some of the groups that created material or were creative, and then they saw some of that they were doing for fun, and then they were going offline, and things were taken over as symbols for real political context, so to speak, that might have been parody or done with an ironic kind of intention or whatever. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that kind of, in that kind of sense.
So I'd agree with what Bernhard and you have said about political context. With respect to Q, it seems to me that yes, of course, it's a transnational movement. In the UK, there have been a number of debates, and it has a certain affective appeal. Who doesn't want to save the children? I mean, what kind of reasonable person would be against that? And it has, of course, a kind of a pretty self-encompassing worldview. But I actually tend to agree with Bernhard that there's very little political space for it in highly secular countries. It is so infused with American Christianity. I mean, it's really intertangled with a kind of Protestant evangelicalism that is very specific to the American context. The thing that I think is very interesting or dangerous about Q from our perspective of hacking democracy, obviously it's a conspiracy theory, it's violent or has violent elements to it. We saw some Q supporters part of the incitement on the insurrection on the 6th. there have been other acts of violence ascribed to Q believers. So I mean, it's a cult-like violent phenomenon. But I think to me, what's really fascinating about it is it's like 3.5 years old, right? This appeared in late 2017, took some months off, and the change from 8chan to 8kun. So we're really talking about something that's been around for 40 months. And when we think of the scale and virality of that conspiracy theory, if you map it onto previous ones that developed over sometimes centuries or decades, right? We're talking about something that develops fundamentally over a period of months. And I would hazard a guess that one of the reasons, obviously, the context that we're talking about in terms of social media, but one of the reasons is that Q is so has such a degree of voluntarism, for lack of a better term. You don't just sit back and kind of take in the conspiracy theory. You're sort of enjoying to look for clues. You mentioned gameplay. And I think that's a big part of the appeal, is that any average Joe can kind of, or Jane can take part in the Q conspiracy proactively, not just supporting it, but proactively pushing it along. And obviously that intersects very heavily with what we've kind of talked about earlier in terms of anonymous accounts, messaging boards, some of those which delete content after a period of time, and how difficult it can be, of course, to identify where these people are through uses of VPN and other types of activist tools.
I wanted to stay a bit on this. Thank you, Matthew. I found this very interesting in terms of like how some of these discourses, the temporality, how longitudinally they work, because I think also Rob mentioned this. And for example, how did we get from the anti-Islamic rhetoric, to pro-Trump? For instance, we did some work with Joanna Ferra on this and looking at aftermaths of Twitter, and she was talking to me about this evolution of the anti-Islamic all the way to pro-Trump. That there were a couple of years between 2015 and 2017, 2014 and 2017, where this kind of evolution of the discourse was happening semantically, particularly in the Twitter that Joanna was doing the analysis on. And I want to ask you about this, because I know coincidentally, Rob, that you were looking at the same period, whether you noticed this longitudinal story of the evolution of the discourse going towards directions, like in the depth of time. If he's here, have we lost Rob? Oh no. This is where you have to check whether someone's actually here. Maybe he's not. Well, I mean, that's an observation that I wanted to make. Perhaps we can take it the conversation in another direction. Do other people have any questions? I was also interested in because it happened recently, and I haven't kept up with the story and the whole development of the situation. I was going to ask what's happening in Russia, Alexander, because normally you have all these demonstrations, arrests and things, and then we don't hear anything about it after a while. So do you have any kind of perspective to offer us today about this? Have you had the chance to look at it? Because I know you follow closely Belarus and Russia.
Yeah, I think it's actually an example of what I've been talking about, when pro-democracy activists learn quite fast how to adapt to new challenges and how to move between platforms and experiment with new approaches. But what's happening with this Navalny pro-democracy movement in Russia is something that's been going on for a while, since 2017 at least. It's a combination of many stories, and just the recent iteration relates to, in a sense, the same struggle, the same movement that just sort of now relies on different sets of platforms, including TikTok. So I think Russian movement became the first movement that politicized TikTok to the scale of thousands and thousands of political messages appearing on this platform under certain hashtags in a matter of few hours.
Is
where
it true
people.
that there was this moral panic about children being radicalized on TikTok, and moral panic about that, and that it was disseminated by Russian state-owned media and that kind of thing?
This is, I think, it's an old counter narrative that being produced and circulated by Russian authorities for a while, since 2017 again. So it's not there is nothing new, just a new platform. So previously the movement been accused of politicizing school kids essentially, and indeed many young people take part in this movement. It's very young generation movement, but all types of demographics joined, but very young people in particular. And they even adopted a new law that kind of forbids this type of politicization. But in fact, it's not new at all. They just, again, they realized that perhaps young audience is on TikTok, so we need to move there as well. And they were quite successful, at least in January.
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask you something specific about that. Do you think, what is the level of rupture between the communist legacy and the, like the post-Soviet kind of story in relation to how the government is doing disinformation and stopping activists and policing? And I mean, I think that is a fascinating thing for me. I don't know if I had a chance to think about it at all.
So clearly the Russian government has a large toolbox of all types of methods and tools of disinformation that has this Soviet legacy, and they sometimes sort of use it. But I think they were quite successful also in developing a new tradition of deceptive and disinformation campaigns that rely on traditional media. And with their decline in this country in particular, I think they experience a bit of a crisis of a genre. What to do? Well, in fact, obviously, their famous attempts to engage in foreign elections in other countries were designed based on those old toolkits, but with sort of first been trained inside the country in 2012 and later and earlier, and then only applied abroad. But when it comes to domestic story, I think it's more complex, and they don't look that good and powerful on the internet as it might look like from abroad.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone else had any more questions here that they were eager to ask, clarifications. So I hope I'm not missing the discussions. I even used my reading glass to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So in that case, I think we can finish this get together, and I'm happy to see so many faces that I know joining us as well in the audience. And thank you everyone for coming to this. I know that I learned quite a bit, and I hope you enjoyed this. So thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you, Athina.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Athina.